Melissa Harrison here for our latest edition of Religion Unplugged, the Media Project podcast. Joining me in the studio today is our Executive Director, Paul Glatter, who is here along with Dr. Desta Heliso, our guest today from Ethiopia. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You two spent some time together at an event here in New York City recently, the Oden symposium. Tell us about that.
So we were remembering the legacy of Tom Oden at Central Presbyterian Church here and gathering scholars from around the world who knew Tom Oden. And I have to say, Desta here was the first person who told me about Tom Oden and who he was and what his work meant. And I was in a cafe, a group of us in a cafe in Addis Ababa, and it was very touching to hear. And could you tell our listeners who was Tom Oden and what was his work about, Desta?
Well, I didn't know Tom Oden until 11 years ago. It was 11 years ago that I met him in Addis Ababa when he came with many other people from within Africa and outside Africa to hold a workshop. And he had published a book called How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind. And through that book, and of course meeting him during that time, I became aware that he was someone who was a liberal scholar, and he was a rising star, really, quite a well-known figure within the world of scholarship, that is the world of theology. But then he decided, he kind of changed his mind. He had a Damascus Road experience, and he became a more conservative scholar. And then he became interested in early African Christianity. So he started to explore early African Christianity and all those scholars, African scholars who had shaped the Christian mind in the early periods.
And we should let our listeners know, Dr. Heliso, that you are with the Ethiopian Graduate School of Theology there in Addis, returning back to research and lecturing.
Yes, I served the school for 8 years as its director, and finished my term as director, and had a sabbatical for over a year. And now I'm lecturing and doing research at the Ethiopian Graduate School of Theology, and also coordinating a small joint PhD program, which we are running with the Free University of Amsterdam.
Fantastic. So, to this idea of early African Christianity, my first time to Africa, I think I might have told you, I was getting emails or comments of people sending links, people from Germany, friends from Germany, journalists, people who are not religious, sending me links suggesting that, the West, missionaries from America were going to Uganda and trying to promote religious conservatism and kind of suggesting that religion is a new phenomenon in Africa. Even sometimes people see it as opium for the masses, right? Wasn't that what Karl Marx said about religion? And Oden's work and your work and the scholars with Center for Early African Christianity point out that is an incorrect notion, right? And explain why that's not correct.
Well, Christianity has been in Africa for about 1,800 years. And in Ethiopia, for example, where I come from, it's been there for almost 1,700 years. Actually, if you go back to the Ethiopian eunuch, it's been there for almost 2,000 years, one could argue, but we don't have any evidence to argue that the Ethiopian eunuch preached the gospel in Ethiopia. But many Ethiopian Christians, even some Christian scholars would argue that way. So Christianity has been in Ethiopia in Africa, in Egypt, and in Ethiopia for many years. It's not a new phenomenon as such. To make what kind of to confirm what you said, some people even call Christianity Western religion. It's not a Western religion. It's been a religion in Africa for years and years. It was there in Libya, as Tom Oden has shown. It was there for 500 years, and in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Egypt, Christianity was the dominant religion in all those countries. Ethiopia, from the 4th century onwards, has been or was a Christian country, and it was state religion until 1974. That was even after missionaries, Protestant missionaries from the West, came to Ethiopia. And, Marx was wrong, of course, about what he said about religion in general. And religion has always been part of the African life, and it is, of course, part of everyone's life in the world. But religion is everything for Africa. But Christianity has kind of transformed the notion of religion in Africa, religion as a culture. So it has brought quite a lot of good to Africa, I would say, but it is now being spoiled because we have departed from that early form of African Christianity to a more postmodern, individual-centered type of Christianity. And I hope that we will go back to the early African Christianity where sacrifice and suffering are central, and people are more interested in participating in Christ's life than just bettering their own lives.
One of the phrases at this symposium that returned several times throughout the day was that the scholarship of Tom Oden showed us, and the ongoing scholarship of his students and friends shows us again and again that Christianity didn't spread north to south, but actually south to north, the contributions. Yeah. Could you point to a few, some of the early church fathers and, example of one, two, or three of these people and their contributions that we can observe that are really important?
It's not that Christianity moved from south to north, but it was Christian thinking. All the Christian traditions, like exegetical tradition, the monastic tradition, Neoplatonism, etc. All those things, according to Oden, moved from south to north, or from Africa to Europe, not the other way around. Of course, some people would argue differently because of the interplay between Africa and the rest of the world, Athens and Syria and Rome and so on. So, that is his argument, and I, on the whole, I agree with him. For example, the Western Christian tradition is heavily influenced by Augustine, and also Tertullian. They're all from Africa. For example, there is a heretic called Arius. Arian Christology still influences many people. Because he was condemned by the church in the church council in the 4th century. Arius was from Libya, and many people wouldn't be openly supporting him, but it was quite interesting. Chris Hall, a man called Chris Hall, recently during the symposium, he said when students were asked, or some organization asked people if they agreed with Arius, about more than 70% said yes. They agreed it was quite shocking in a way. And all those people have influenced world Christianity in various ways. There was a scholar called Cyril of Alexandria, whose Christology, whose thinking about Christ continues to influence many. And Martin Luther was influenced heavily by Cyril of Alexandria. and many others.
So tell us about your work at the graduate school, the Ethiopian Graduate School of Theology. You say you have about 200 graduate students there.
Mm-hmm.
What is the work that you're doing, the things that they're studying, and how do you find the students to be in their study of religion there in Addis?
Well, I mainly teach, I lecture various courses like Jewish literature of the Second Temple period, we call them. That is Jewish literature that existed between, the end of the exile, and that is the exile of the Israelites, and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. There's the literature that existed during that period I studied, and I also teach the New Testament, mainly Pauline literature, and I'm interested in Christology, but I'm interested in generally in how theology can influence society, basically religion in the public square. So I write articles to newspapers and websites, etc., because I'm kind of secondarily interested in politics. So my secondary interest is politics, and I read about politics. So I try to combine biblical studies, particularly theology, with politics. So my main role is at the moment teaching and research. So I'm trying to publish a book on Paul's Christology in Romans and comparative traditions, focusing on Ethiopian Christian traditions, but comparing with patristic traditions from the Church Fathers, and also comparing with Western theological traditions. So it's a kind of bridge building attempt, really, bridge building between Ethiopian Christian traditions and Western Christian traditions, and trying to show how one can kind of offer something to the other, how one can learn from the other. Ethiopian Christian traditions have not been known by many, because Ethiopia was a closed country for many years. There was a lot of suspicion. But anyway, we do that, and our students come from different backgrounds, and many of them are part-time students. They work in government and non-governmental offices, and they're professionals, but there are also full-time students. Wow. We do both theological and professional courses. So we try to prepare theological leaders, but we also try to prepare professional leaders. So we teach biblical and theological courses, and we teach leadership and theology. We teach development and theology as well. So they're all postgraduate students. So they get postgraduate diploma, Master of Arts, and Master of Theology. Now we are running a joint PhD program, hopefully. Some will get doctorate as well, but from Amsterdam, not from us. We are a very young institution, only 21 years old. So we have got quite a long way to go to grow, yeah.
You were talking about your interest in religion in the public square, and so these ideas we talked about of Africa's role in Christian thought. What's your take on? It sounds like those ideas are relevant not just to church history and Christian history and religion history and theology schools, but also to the public square. And what are you and the Center for Early African Christianity at Yale? What are you all finding? Is the impact of those ideas in among people in Africa, as well as we could talk about African Americans and the church more broadly, the global Christian church. How well are those ideas known, and what is the impact do you think to people when they know those ideas?
Well, we cannot assess the impact as yet, But as I said, EGST, the Ethiopian Graduate School of Theology, is a young institution, and we are trying to kind of establish various centers that can help us sort of organize workshops, for example, for government officials, for church leaders, and so on. And through those centers, we can try to promote ideas, kind of religious ideas that can shape public policy, for example, and so on. But now, the Center for Early African Christianity has inspired us to start a Center for Ancient Christianity and Ethiopian Studies. Ethiopian society and religion cannot be divorced. You cannot understand Ethiopia without religion, because Christianity came to Ethiopia in the 4th century. There were traditional religions before that, and they existed for a long time, and they still exist. Islam came to Ethiopia right at the beginning. It's in the 7th century. About 80 or 90 Meccans were sent by Muhammad to Ethiopia because they were persecuted in Mecca. So Islam has existed in Ethiopia for a long time, and Christianity has. So we have to understand religion or religions in order to understand our society. And religion is very important for us, as you know, to develop moral fiber of society. And without religion, we cannot develop that. And politicians have to have moral fiber in order to be good politicians, and societal leaders and elders have to have the same. And in order to develop that, we have to promote these ideas. And I think theological ideas can play a huge role in all that. They can bring together different Christian traditions. Catholics, Orthodox are very influential in Ethiopia, and Protestant evangelicals. And they can come together and develop ideas that can be useful, not only for the promotion of Christian faith, but also for the development of, for the societal moral progress, if you like. So that is how I can see religion playing a crucial role in the public square in terms of influencing politicians and societal leaders and others in different places. And hopefully, through that, there will be less corruption in Africa. There will be less violence in Africa. And hopefully better economies. At the moment, many African countries are struggling. They are struggling to maintain peace. They're struggling to root out corruption. They're struggling to develop their economies because people are interested in just accumulating wealth for themselves than sharing with others. And all that, I think, can be promoted through kind of promoting religious ideas that are developed in a way that is helpful. At the moment, fatalism is a big thing, and that we need to address that as well through developing religious ideas.
David Bailey, one of the speakers, I recall him telling a story that he tries to explain these concepts of early African Christianity, the role of African Christianity to African American young people and young leaders, and he's had the experience of some breaking down and weeping because of this. The issue of race in our society in the U.S. is there's divides, as we know, and Christians, there's a strong African American Christian community in this country that had. I heard speakers talking about this element of them sensing the church in America, for example, in our minds thinking this is a white man's religion, for example. When they realize, no, wait a second, the church in Africa, the Christians in Africa had contributed to the thought that really. We heard it several times, I think, at the weekend conference, how powerfully that impacted some people. And there was pastors from Brooklyn and the Bronx and others who are very excited to take these ideas to their congregations. And so have you seen that as well? I remember your comments. You said you had a different experience with race coming from Ethiopia, studying in London.
Yeah, I think many Africans, it's not only African Americans in USA who need to learn about that, but also Ethiopians and Black Africans, North Africans, all of them need to learn about these things. We in Ethiopia didn't used to appreciate the contributions of early African Christians to the shaping of the Christian mind in the world. But over the last decade or so, we've come to appreciate that because of Tom Oden's insistence that we should kind of try to go back to our roots, our Christian, early Christian roots, and try to understand what early Christians did. Now, I'm a convert. I didn't used to believe that Augustine and Tertullian and others they believed that they were African because they were from North Africa. And many Black Africans think in the same way. They still do, and they didn't study them. And that was what Tom Oden challenged. He could say things that other people would be afraid to say. It was very, very important. And now his thinking is, in my view, is uniting Africans. North Africans are now thinking that they are indeed part of Africa. They are, of course, North African countries are part of the African Union, but they still think that they are in the Middle East, in the Middle Eastern region. And Black Africans think that they are in the Middle Eastern region. They're not part of Africa, although they are part of the African Union. But I think this thinking is bringing us together. Africa is extremely divided. We speak Amharic only in Ethiopia, and there are Arab-speaking African countries, Francophone, Lusophone, and Anglophone. They're all divided. It's very difficult to communicate with one another. But this, I think, the early African Christian thinking, going back to the early African Christians, is going to help us to come together and think about Africa and its contributions to the world. But how should it help us has always been my question. Tom Oden would say, you shouldn't have inferiority complex that was caused by the colonial past, he would say. Of course, Ethiopia wasn't colonized, so we don't struggle with that. And that was what I said during the symposium when I went to London. I went there with almost nil color consciousness. So I'm black, but I didn't have that black consciousness. And it was my other African friends who always talked about their color consciousness. That was mainly caused by the colonial past. And that awareness was created in me. many Ethiopians still don't feel that way. If they look at you, they just look at the white man, who is a person. He's white, I'm black, but there is no difference. Whereas in USA, for example, amongst African Americans, that's not the case. And in other African countries that were colonized, that's not the case either. So how does it help us is the question. I would say, will it contribute to our pride? Or it shouldn't, surely. Or will it contribute to our self-understanding? Maybe. And what will that self-understanding contribute to? Maybe to our appreciation of the past and to whatever. I think we have to kind of work out what this will help us with. Understanding our past, our Christian roots, the contribution of early African Christians. So I'm still thinking through that, and I think its contribution should be, to something better than just we Africans contributed to the world, and our thinking shaped the Christian mind, etc., etc. I think we have to be careful about those things. It could easily lead us to pride, but I prefer to be humble about this, because yes, lots of ideas were flourishing in Africa in the first 4 or 5 centuries, and maybe 6 centuries. A lot was happening in Ethiopia until Islam. There was jihadist campaign in the 16th century in Ethiopia, during which many monasteries were destroyed and many manuscripts were destroyed and many priests were killed. And it was a huge setback in Ethiopian Christian history. But what have we done with all that? With all those ideas? Very little. And how have those ideas contributed to the development of Africa? How have they impacted the African socioeconomic and cultural life? We have to ask critical questions about those things. We can appreciate our past. We can be proud of what the early African Christians contributed to the world, but we just have to ask ourselves, what have those ideas contributed to our socioeconomic and political and cultural development? So when I think about it, I prefer humility rather than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the humility should go both directions, and I hope that, and to me, frankly, when you first told me about Tom Oden and his ideas, I think it helped me understand that, the gospel of Jesus Christ in the Christian thought, transcends cultural boundaries, transcends geographic boundaries, transcends ethnic boundaries, all kinds of boundaries in ways we didn't even imagine before. And so I think the humility is important, in each continent to realize that the gospel of Jesus Christ wasn't, established from evangelical churches in the Midwest of the United States, nor places of Europe, or as you're saying, even parts of Africa, but it transcends all these things, right?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah. Yeah, that should be our focus, really. Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of our listeners to the podcast are journalists working around the world, and we do have several journalists in Africa, different parts of different countries in Africa. What is the state of journalism in Ethiopia right now?
The state of journalism in Ethiopia right now is improving. I have to say, it was. We went through a period that was very, very difficult for journalists. Journalists couldn't stand for truth, and they're there to, as we would say in Christian world, to minister to the truth, as it were, to promote truth. But it was very difficult for many journalists to speak the truth. If they did, they would be thrown into prison, and many suffered for the sake of truth. But now there is a lot of freedom. Over the last 6 months, a lot of change has happened as a result of change of prime minister. We have new prime minister who has released all the journalists from prison and released many other political prisoners as well. So there is a lot of change, a lot of hope. I used to joke to my students when they wrote essays, they often were descriptive. So I would say, please don't be over descriptive like ETV journalists, because ETV journalists would only talk about what happened. They wouldn't analyze what happened critically. They wouldn't raise questions, why people did what they did, etc. But now that is possible, and there is a lot of good future, I have to say, for journalism in Ethiopia.
Yeah, we look forward to, as a media project, to coming back to Ethiopia to see our friends there soon, many journalism friends there. And I know our board chairwoman's fond of Ethiopia and has been interested in the story there about trees and how the headline, I think, is something like how theology is saving the environment.
Yes, she came to know a photojournalist from Scotland who was inspired by what he saw in the Google map. And he found out that when he saw the Google map of Ethiopia, there was a lot of desert in Ethiopia, but in the middle of the desert, he would see green area, and lots of small green areas were there. And he found out that those green areas where there were trees were churches. So he decided to work on that project, the church and trees. So basically he photographed quite a lot of that, and he did exhibition recently in September in California, and I was extremely impressed by what he did, what he showed, and I would like him to come to EGST, my institution, and to present his work. And it's very, very useful. And I think, Roberta just said theology is saving the environment.
Right, because you were saying that it wasn't that the churches just planted trees to block the wind. He was taking these drone photographs, and but the finding wasn't that the churches were planting the trees to block the wind or to use the trees to build the church, use the wood, right? It was something different.
They were creating small gardens of Eden. Yeah. So basically replicating or recreating the Garden of Eden. And they, as this gentleman said, they were trying to understand the invisible through the visible.
Well, it's quite beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation, having Dr. Desta Heliso here to get to have a perspective of what's happening in Ethiopia when it comes to religion, when it comes to journalism, how they intersect, and we're excited to share this with our TMP listeners.
Thank you very much for having me.